Hello everyone and thank you in advance for your time. My name is Peyman Yousefi and I'm a PhD student of environmental engineering in Lille's School of Civil Engineering at Purdue University. I'm presenting this research on behalf of my colleagues Dr. Sheen from National Universities of Singapore, Samuel Park and Manuel Amin, my lab mates at Purdue, and Dr. David Yo, my advisor. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about whether and how communication among users and providers can improve the provision of public water service using a framed human behavioral experiment. So, among the factors that are reported to affect the cooperative behaviors among people, such as trust, uncertainty, and sanctioning, we already know from previous experimental studies, either in the lab or in the field, that communication in the form of non binding cheap talk among participants also improves communication in common pool resources and can improve the provision of public goods. And the reasoning behind the effectiveness of communication relies on the fact that rather than assuming people to be selfish, rational individuals who always aim to improve their own payoff with complete information, is proof that majority of participants in the experiments and also in the real life are classified as conditional cooperators, meaning that they will cooperate in collective actions if they expect others will do so in that situation. So, considering this, and as a result of such observational situation, communication enables participants to basically signal their intentions and trustworthiness that would increase the overall cooperation among them. Another background of this research lies in the user agency interactions around infrastructure. So, in the past decades, unreliable water supply systems and their socio-economic impacts have been widely reported all around the world, and one of the critical challenges for public water sectors is to ensure enough water service provision in the face of potential underinvestment in the infrastructure. It's also reported that in some cases, providers might be tempted to pursue their own private gain by underinvesting in the infrastructure and barely or not meeting users' expectations. So, an important challenge faced by users is how to incentivize providers, or in some cases, to force providers to increase and maintain their investment at a sufficient level. To answer this question, decentralization has received much attention as a key institutional reform to deal with poorly performing providers. And broadly, there are two forms of decentralization. Economic decentralization focuses on lowering institutional barriers for users to choose new infrastructure providers, and political decentralization, on the other hand, is about empowering users themselves to communicate, monitor, and even sanction a poorly performing provider. This same idea can be also connected to the work of American economist Dr. Albert Hirschman, who in 1970 proposed that there are two primary responses to dissatisfaction in organizational context, which is exit and voice. The exit option, by definition, represents an individual's shift to an alternative, better performing service provider, and the voice option, on the other hand, represents an organized effort of a group to correct an undesirable practice and policies of existing provider. As you can see, the relationship between voice exit and those economic and political decentralizations. So, of course, it's critical to investigate which of the two forms of decentralization, or in this case, the two broad form of social feedbacks in these user agency interactions of exit and voice, is more effective in inducing providers to improve their public infrastructure. And we actually investigated that, but for this specific research, we raised these questions that can the beneficial role of communication that we already discussed also applicable to use this user agency interaction problem surrounding public infrastructure provision, and can communication drive user agency interactions, or basically exit and voice and the responses of provider, to a more sustainable outcome. So in this study, to answer those questions, we developed and conducted an online human behavioral experiment where a set of participants that were recruited through Amazon Mechanical Turk with two roles of being three farmers and one provider in each group interacted for maintaining a good quality water service in two sets of 10 repetitive rounds that I will talk about in next slides. And here you can also see the number of groups and number of participants per each treatments, highlighting those treatments that are focus of this presentation. In this experiment, as I mentioned, there are three farmers who take water from a shared irrigation infrastructure to grow crop, which gives them their earning, but in order to do so, they need to pay some service fees to the provider who is in charge of maintaining the irrigation infrastructure and must decide how to use these collected revenues from farmers. And so, considering this interaction between farmers and the providers and the options they had, the infrastructure could remain fully or not fully functional, which would then define the earnings of each participant in this experiment. So now let's briefly talk about each treatment. As you can see, each treatment started with 10 rounds of baseline in which farmers were given some tokens in each round and were asked to either pay or hold their tokens, while the provider could decide between keeping or investing those raised revenues from farmers. After the baseline rounds were finished, they would be directed to the treatment rounds, which were exactly similar to the baseline, except for giving farmers a new option. In this case, it was petition option, which was basically the voice option of Hirschman work. Here it was alternative, which was a representation of exiting the system in that round, and then finally giving them both options. So now, to see how communication would affect this treatment, which was the objective of this presentation and research, we created a situation in which users and providers could communicate with each other in each round using a text-based chat room that we created. We also created another treatment that was exactly like the baseline without any extra options, but with the communication between farmers and provider. And here you can basically see these four treatments of the focus of this research. Now let's focus on some initial results. In this slide, the overall outcome of all these treatments are shown. For us to be able to analyze and compare the effectiveness of these treatments, we define three variables that closely relate to different components of the systems, and these variables are average infrastructure state, average invest, and average pay threshold. Average infrastructure states relate to the condition of infrastructure in each round. Average invest relates to providers' decisions regarding investment, and average pay threshold focuses on the farmers' collective decisions in paying. And basically, as the number increases from 0 to 1, the situation gets better. So as you can see in the figures, in almost all the cases, these three variables were improved in the treatment round, which is the second 10 rounds in comparison with the baseline. But what is more important here is that petition option, either individually or when it's combined with communication, have generally shown a better outcome regarding these variables. On the other hand, alternative or exit option didn't show enough improvement in the treatment rounds. Just in case, in these figures, results of the last two rounds were not included to avoid this so-called end of experiment effect, but if we wanted to include those rounds, the graph would look like something like this, which shows how selfishly participants would behave in the last round, as they knew there will be no consequences for them. In this slide, we focus only on those treatment with communication, and using a Wilcoxon sign rank test, we tested whether or not the improvement of those three variables, which was infrastructure state, investment, and threshold pay, in the treatment rounds were statistically significant in comparison with the baseline. And as we would expect, the improvements were indeed significant in all the four treatments. More importantly, it showed that communication was even more impactful in improving the situation when it was the only representation of the voice option among farmers and the provider, in comparison when farmers had already access to petition option in that case. So basically, as you can see in the figures, in those right treatments where there was no petition, second 10 rounds showed significantly higher improvement in those three variables in comparison with the first 10 rounds. But the important thing is, we could already expect that the situation in the second 10 rounds will indeed improve in comparison with baseline. This almost happened even without communication, as you remember in the last slide. So we still haven't answered the question of whether communication would improve the effect of other social feedbacks, which is basically exit and voice, which was actually our objective and research question yet. So, in order for us to see if communication has helped the other social feedbacks, we should compare the second 10 rounds of this treatment with each other without considering the baseline, which was similar in each treatment. More specifically, we wanted to evaluate what happens in the second 10 rounds of, for example, alternative treatment in comparison with alternative and communication treatment, or petition treatment in comparison with petition and communication treatment. Here you can actually see the result of such comparison using a Mann-Whitney U-test. And as you can see here, while communication actually helped alternative and petition options individually, it didn't lead to any significant improvement when both options were available to the farmers, which was actually against our initial hypothesis, because we would expect that the existence of all these social feedbacks together, which is a representation of modern life as we could see, would lead to both higher outcomes and higher improvement in this treatment, which wasn't seen in communication rounds. One explanation at this point can be related to the experimental design that may have been affecting the decisions of the farmers and provider, as it could be confusing or timely for them to finish the experiment with all these options together that they had. So in summary, this experimental design and research showed that while communication was indeed helpful for improvement of alternative and petitions individually, which was representation of those user-agency interaction, it didn't lead to significant improvement when both of them were available for farmers or users in general. And we also showed that communication was more effective than petition in both the overall outcome and improvements of the alternative options. In terms of the future work, from now on, while we are still continuing more data analysis on our result, which also includes the qualitative data analysis of the chat data between participants in each round, we are also aiming to investigate other factors that we know and also reported to be effective in people's cooperative behaviors, such as environmental variability to the system, rivalry among participants, and existence of inequality and heterogeneity in the roles. And thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me for any question, as I will be more than happy to connect with you. Here you can also see my email and other related social media accounts, and I wish you all the best.